Thank you.
Yeah.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending on where you are. Welcome to the fourth in the series, African Universities and COVID-19. Today's topic is the economic, food security, and livelihood impacts of COVID-19 in Africa, lessons learned, and policy responses. I would like to, first of all, introduce our four presenters and to welcome them. The first presenter will be Professor Mame Samba Mbaye from the University Cheikh Anta Diop. The second presenter will be Dr. David Tschirley from Michigan State University. And the fourth presenter will be Dr. Godfrey Bahigwa from the African Union Commission. And then finally, Professor Agnes Manguela from the Longo University of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Their bios are provided, so you can read them. Before they speak, let me just make a few brief remarks. COVID-19, of course, as we all know, is a major public health crisis. As of this morning, confirmed cases worldwide is 7,127,753, according to WHO. And for Africa, it's 145,287. In terms of deaths worldwide, the number has reached 407,159. It's not, of course, just a public health crisis. It is also having huge political, economic impact. Political, of course, is putting pressure on governments to provide effective mitigations from healthcare to economic interventions and safeguarding livelihoods. It's exposing the strengths and weaknesses of national healthcare systems and social safety nets, as well as, of course, putting governments and national leaders. Some of them are using the crisis to advance their own political and ideological agendas, some of which, of course, are not positive. And it's reinforcing nationalism and weakening globalization, thereby posing great challenges for coordinated multilateral and international responses. It's of course a major economic crisis. According to the World Bank, COVID-19 has delivered an enormous global shock, leading to steep recessions in many countries. The baseline forecast envisions a 5.2% contraction in global GDP this year, the deepest global recession in decades. Per capita incomes in most emerging and developing economies, according to the bank, will shrink this year. The biggest impact has been, of course, on already vulnerable populations. Economic activity in sub-Saharan Africa is expected to contract by 2.8% in 2020, the deepest on record. Per capita GDP is anticipated to fall even more sharply, likely pushing millions in the region back to extreme poverty. There have been, of course, huge disruptions of global value chains and regional, national, and local economic activities and businesses. The impact on livelihoods, which is, of course, the topic of our discussion today, can be seen in various ways. One of, obviously, the impact on COVID-19 has led to massive unemployment. According to the ILO, by the end of May this year, which is last month, 94% of the world's workers are living in countries with some sort of workplace closure measures in place. The prospects for the second quarter of 2020 are dire, with the latest ILO estimates revealing a decline in working hours of around 10.7% relative to the last quarter of 2019, which is equivalent to 305 million full-time jobs. It's also, of course, COVID-19 undermining the provision of essential services, including health and education. The devastating impact on food security and livelihoods of tens of millions of people in terms of food production, availability and access, and of course, food and nutrition security for different population groups based on income, gender, age, location, etc., is also quite severe. Sub-Saharan Africa is the world's most food insecure region, which is compounded by climate change. According to the IMF, COVID-19 pandemic is the latest catastrophe to have swollen the ranks of 240 million people going hungry in the region. In some countries, over 70% of the population has problems accessing food. The measures to contain and manage the COVID-19 pandemic, while critical to saving lives, have exacerbated food insecurity. Border closures, lockdowns, and curfews intended to slow the spread of the disease are disrupting supply chains that, even under normal circumstances, struggle to stock markets and supply farmers with seeds and other inputs. The most recent figures from the ILO show that young people are disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 crisis, with multiple shocks, including disruption to education and training, employment and income losses, and greater difficulties in finding a job. A total of 178 million young workers around the world, more than 4 in 10 young people employed globally, were working in hard-hit sectors when the crisis began. Recent data point to a massive increase in the youth unemployment rate since February 2020, particularly for young women. There is enormous pressure on governments to provide, of course, mitigation measures, including stimulus packages and support for the most vulnerable groups. Clearly, African governments need to prioritize policies targeted at reducing risks to food security as part of fiscal stimulus packages to counter the pandemic. According to the IMF, these policies should focus on increasing agricultural output and strengthening households' ability to withstand shocks. This would have the added benefit of reducing inequalities while boosting economic growth and jobs. A few years ago, finally, the African Development Bank released a roadmap to deal with the crisis that recommends immediate, short, and medium-term solutions to the agriculture sector, including support of food delivery for the most vulnerable, stabilization of food prices, optimization of food processing, extension support services, and provision of key agricultural inputs through smart subsidies. Our 4 presenters today will be sharing their views, their understanding of the economic, food security, and livelihood impacts of COVID-19 in Africa. What have we learned, both in terms of the systemic and structural challenges COVID-19 has revealed and the opportunities for transformation? What can we do to address the situation now, and what practical approaches should we pursue for the future? How have their institutions, that is the presenters, their institutions, schools, departments, responded to these global, continental, and national COVID-19 challenges? What innovative collaborative ideas are in the pipeline in their institutions, schools, departments, in providing policy responses to the negative impacts of COVID-19? Once again, welcome to the forum. We all expect very exciting discussions, presentations, and of course discussions from the Q&A that are going to follow the presentations. So as I said at the beginning, the first presenter is Professor Samba Mbaye. Professor Mbaye, please welcome to the forum, and go ahead to make your presentation.
Merci, professeur Salazar, de m'avoir donné la parole. Merci à AAP d'avoir organisé cette session, et mesdames, messieurs les participants. Aujourd'hui, je suis censé parler d'un sujet assez vaste et complexe, constitue un peu la sécurité alimentaire. Et en 10 minutes, je devrais pouvoir introduire, je vais parler brièvement de l'impact de la COVID sur la sécurité alimentaire au Sénégal et des actions menées par les autorités, de même que celles qui sont entreprises au niveau de l'Université Cheikh Anta Diop de Dakar. Dans ce contexte de pandémie de COVID-19, dont le premier cas a été enregistré au Sénégal le 2 mars, et aujourd'hui, nous en sommes à 4640 cas avec 52 décès qui sont assez regrettables. Et avec cette pandémie, il y a une forte peur, et cette peur a fait prendre aux autorités des mesures, parmi lesquelles des mesures de confinement, des mesures de réduction, si vous voulez, de la mobilité pour endiguer la propagation du virus SARS-CoV-2. Ces mesures ont eu beaucoup de répercussions négatives. Et ici, il faut parler de ces répercussions sur la sécurité alimentaire qui fait que cette pandémie a placé beaucoup de personnes dans l'insécurité alimentaire. Pour preuve, au Sénégal, en mars, 5 départements étaient à situation préoccupante, 17 à situation précaire et 23 étaient à situation à peu près acceptable. Alors, pour un petit rappel, au Sénégal, l'alimentation a jadis été caractérisée par 3 repas.
Excuse me,
Yeah.
1 minute. I think
Yeah.
the English translation is not on. Can we ensure the English translation is on?
D'accord, donc est-ce que c'est OK? Justin, le PowerPoint n'est pas affiché aussi?
If if the interpreter could unmute himself, Mohammed.
Okay.
Just 1 moment.
Yes, Justin aussi.
How about now? Is it okay
yes,
now?
Yes.
Yes.
It's
Yes.
okay now? I'm sorry. Okay,
Yes,
technology,
thank you.
sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah, okay. Thank you,
Thank you
Prof.
very much.
Celeste. Thank you. Sorry about this
Thank
technological glitch. Okay, let's try
you.
again.
Professor,
Okay.
please continue.
Okay, merci. Thank
Professor
you.
Mbaye.
Okay, thank you, Professor Mbaye. Thank you. Thank you. I was saying a while ago that the disease, the pathology, COVID-19 disease, the first case we had it in Senegal, March 2nd. Now we have 4,640 cases, confirmed cases, with 52 deaths out of 7,000 cases. 7 million cases we have worldwide. This led to fear, and because of that, the authorities have taken those drastic decisions, semi-containment and reduction of mobility of people. And these measures have had a negative impact, among those we have access to food security, etc. So in Senegal, for example, 5 departments have been impacted. These are the data that have been generated last month. 17 are under precarious situation, and 3 are having acceptable situation. Now, just a reminder, Senegal, the food in Senegal is based on the 3 meals, sometimes less than 3 meals, because due to the issues or just because of reason. This food is based on production activities, farming activities, fisheries, animal husbandries that would allow to having self-reliance. But the systems that were doing a good job during colonial time have been disturbed recently. What's been noted, so people have been coming back to cash crops versus food crops versus cash crops. And now we are now being nostalgic. We would like to go back to really food reliance as in the past. And if he can slow down, if I can ask him to slow down a little bit. When someone asks him to slow down a little bit. In Senegal, we we're quite self-sufficient in meat and fish, etc. With a combination of production and imports, cereals, dairy products. What you have to understand that is there's an availability, food availability that is left to be desired. And things are not that stable and are really left to the vagaries of the climate. So food security in Senegal defines. That's when people, human beings, can have access, physical access, economic access to decent food, nutritional food that will allow them to satisfy their energy needs in order to have an active and healthy life. That's the definition by FAO. This food security in Senegal can be seen based on three angles, before COVID, during COVID, and after COVID. But in a nutshell, what we can take back home, we have limited access to before and after COVID. Before COVID, it's a structural issue due to a certain number of issues, farming issues, agricultural issues, connected to rainfall, etc., less of diversification of our crops. And when COVID right, we had a situational problem with limited access to food and also disturbance of those supply chain channels. So when we have post-COVID, well, we'll be having issues of supplies and disturbances of supply chains in the field, issues also concerning labor, because of reduction of mobility, the marketing of goods are impacted, things are delayed, and this leads to dropping of production. So in a nutshell, we need to have to be very smart in order to avoid really falling on poverty and hunger. So for food security, we realize limited access for certain categories of people during and before COVID. So we'll have to have a strong analysis of our strength in terms of availability of lands, of water, youth, women, policies, strategies, so that we can really see how we can really reduce our weaknesses and really apply right policies so we can really seize the opportunities that are there. And really, this analysis, if we do it correctly, will allow us to take drastic, sound action in order to go to self-reliance. And that's the problem because we've been faced with for quite some time. So now it's very important to really take that on board. Need to be self-reliant. Now, concerning the responses, policy responses in Senegal, we know that there's a strong capacity of governments, of authorities, to drafting some policies, but the implementation is that where we're having problems. We have documents, strategic documents, a framework document that exists. We have the emerging plan of Senegal, agricultural plan, we have a strategy for food security, we have a strategy for nutrition. All these documents, if they're well implemented and things are made transparent, we'll really be addressing these challenges. Now, in addition to that, when the pandemic arrived, there were urgent measures like distribution of food kits for vouchers to those families that have been involved, because families were asked to remain in their homes, and so they had to be supported via those food vouchers and the like, so they can survive and really go beyond this era. And also there are grants of various nature that are given for, but what we've seen in those responses is that the authorities have focused mainly on production elements in order to allow a population to have sound farming production level, because pandemic arrived before rainy season, and now we're moving toward rainy season. So the government has really decide to supporting producers, farmers, grassroots population, so that they can really have a good agricultural activities. But the problem we are faced with is the issue of implementing those policies and programs. Now within our university, Cheikh Anta of Dakar, UCAD, which is, if I may, the largest university in Senegal, with 75,000 students, 1,500 teachers, professors, scholars, and admin people. So UCAD has to support the state and the communities in order to have a sustainable kind of development. The university has developed human capital, has to develop human capital and generate knowledge and know-how, and UCAD has to play a role in eliminating inequalities between gender, between urbans and rural people. Right. In this environment, UCAD has implemented a certain number of policies and programs, interventions, and for research. The university has been implementing a certain number of projects that will allow to having tangible results in order to overturn the trends that we have now and better understand the determining factors, how to improve those determinants in the agricultural production, how we can improve the other determinants of food security. Now, concerning training, now we are having a diversification of training offer to meet the needs of the marketplace in order to also professionalize students with practical cases. So we also have an entrepreneurial component. All UCAD classes and courses have an entrepreneurial component because you have many youngsters that have to be helped in finding a job, creating their own job, etc. So that really the population can really benefit from those positive impacts of the university UCAD. Finally, for these training packages, recently, with the excellence centers of excellence, we have two. One that's renewed through World Bank, have the Center of Excellence, the African Center of Excellence in Agriculture for Food Security and Nutritional Security, the Excellence Center for Environment and Food, and the Excellence Center for Mothers and Children. These are initiatives that are supported by consortia on leadership, but under the leadership of UCAD. These will help really provide responses, tangible responses, efficient responses for the production of human capital, but also this will help also populations better live a decent life. Finally, for service to community, many initiatives have been undertaken. We have the one which is called the initiative of rural which is meant to mobilizing human and financial resources of UCAD so that really socio-economic promotion of Senegal can happen, so that in rural areas in particular. That program is undertaking citizen-based activities, but also puts in place also platforms that are interaction areas, platform, technological platforms, whose pilot is based in Nyanten. I would like to thank AAP, where we undertake lots of intervention for the communities. We are seeing, see the slide we have for us. We are targeting a community in capacity building, training, literacy programs, and also we also focus on youth and women in order to empower women through their organizational management training programs targeting these women and technical programs. Now for students also, we are working, we put them in real areas so they can have a kind of learning by doing experience, and for scholars, for teachers, professors, we can support those youngsters. These programs were quite successful and led to positive results. This year we won the Local Leadership Prize award, thanks to the activities undertaken by production activities that we have been undertaking year in, year out, thanks to capacity building interventions, diversification of production, generation of revenues for women. In 5-month period, we had generated 3 million CFA francs. So for those women, they were allowed to really have access to production tools. So at UCAD, in a nutshell, this is what we've been doing so far. In conclusion, the main lesson, the take-home lesson is that COVID-19 is a pathology, is a disease which really generates lots of suffering, death, etc. But it's a kind of opportunity, a window we have to bank on, so we can really value our own resources and be more sensitized, conscientized, and this can lead us to food self-reliance and improve marketing channels, improvement of food and safety, health safety of food, and also reinforce also interaction with the university. And also this will allow the university to draw the highest benefits from those universities that exist elsewhere in Senegal. Also, we want to diversify interventions and productions, etc., because we bank also on certain species for our food system, but there's a potential species that are underutilized that could be put on the table, and then this will help us really meet our needs and really address the cultural features of our country, and also with our entrepreneurship. Young entrepreneurship is also key, and also women empowerment is also key. These are a few words I wanted to share with the House Professor, and thank you for giving me the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation. Essentially 3 aspects to it. He noted about some of the challenges in thinking about food security, structural, conjunctural, and episodic dynamics. And secondly, in terms of the responses, he shared with us 3 types of responses, research, training, and community outreach. And from that presentation, perhaps, a number of questions arise that he can share with us, address later in more detail once we go to Q&A. The relationship between food crops and cash crops, the whole question of self-reliance, which of course is very old in African thinking about agriculture, but economic development, certainly in the 60s and 70s. And then the whole question of policy and implementation, again, the conundrum of having very elaborate policies, but sometimes implementation is a challenge, and the reasons for that. And then finally, the whole question of how impactful university engagements and outreach are in terms of society. Next, we'll move to Dr. David Tschirley from MSU to share his views.
Okay, thank you, Paul. I'd like to thank the Alliance for African Partnerships for organizing this and really giving me the chance to speak. It's always a pleasure to be able to use these opportunities to put one's thinking together and share that with others, and hopefully have some impact on thinking and actions. So I'm going to be making comments on 3 areas in my time here. Primarily, I'll be speaking about data and knowledge gaps that I think must be filled and can be filled if we're really going to design effective responses to COVID-19. Then I'll say a bit about actions related to food supply chains, and then I will close very briefly about what MSU and our food security group is doing in this area. So first of all, about data and knowledge gaps. I have a baseline assumption that drives much of what I'm going to say, and then I have a couple empirical observations related to that assumption. The assumption is that COVID-19 will be present and it will over a year and perhaps longer, okay? What this means, if this is true, is that there's both the time and the need to fill these data and knowledge gaps to better inform responses. So I have a couple empirical observations related to that. First observation is that COVID-19 seems now to be growing very rapidly in countries that were previously not as heavily affected, okay? This is especially the case in Latin America and South Asia, but it's not limited to that area of the world. These countries that are now seeing very rapid growth include some that previously did very little officially to flatten the curve, that did not have big shutdowns. Examples are Mexico and Brazil. It includes countries that took among the very harshest measures on shutdowns, for example, India, and it includes countries in between, for example, South Africa, which took measures but not as harsh as was seen in India. And thirdly, related to this empirical observation is my observation that in general, African countries beyond South Africa do not appear to be in this group right now of rapidly growing infection. So this suggests to me, given what we know about the pandemic, that the period of exponential growth may be still to come in most of Africa. I'd love to have epidemiological opinions on that, but if that's true, that's a very, very important thing for us obviously to take into account. A second broad empirical observation about this issue is that some countries are now seeing outbreaks in rural areas centered around large families. These are so far limited to developed countries, but might have implications for what we might see eventually further down the line in rural Africa. So related to this basic assumption that I just laid out and the empirical observations that go with that, I have a key contention. And that contention is that you cannot understand or anticipate the impacts of COVID-19 on African food supply chains without understanding and anticipating also its impact on three related things. First of all, its impact on transmission, morbidity, and mortality. Second of all, behavioral responses to the disease and behavioral responses to government actions around the disease, for example, the shutdowns. And third of all, impacts on spending power and livelihoods, okay? So we cannot design good responses without more information on this. So we need more data. This is not just a researcher speaking. We need more data and we need more modeling with that data to make informed judgments about what to do, okay? I will note, however, that, and I liked very much the previous presenters, pre-COVID, during COVID, and post-COVID observation. I will note that the enormous structural investment needs of African food supply chains mean that many of the long-run needs and recommendations are not particularly sensitive to some of these details, but the short-run and even medium-run actions very much are sensitive to what I'm talking about. Okay, so what kind of data and modeling do we need? First of all, we need modeling on transmission, mortality, morbidity, and mortality. Okay, so for example, relating now to food supply chains, on transmission, what is the impact of food shopping patterns of the massive consumers in urban areas versus rural areas on COVID-19 transmission? What do we know about that? We do not know nearly enough about that, okay? This can be modeled, but it requires data on flows over time of people and products. It requires data on resulting densities, congregations of people in different shopping areas, okay? And what I call kind of good enough data on this can be collected in safe and relatively cheap fashion through cell phone surveys and through spatially targeted, what I call regular mapping or counting exercises, relatively simple exercises, which if well organized, can be extremely helpful. And this better modeling here also probably needs to be complemented with much better contact tracing. I would recommend strongly a piece by Paul Richards recently in the website African Arguments. They have a COVID-19 page, a piece by Paul Richards on this, which is really excellent about kind of some of the micro data that's needed and was proved to be so helpful in controlling the Ebola pandemic. Okay, morbidity and mortality, another area where we need more data and modeling. It is a shocking fact that there is no systematic modeling of the impact of Africa's many comorbidities on the COVID-19 death rate. I look for this every week online. I scour online to see is anybody incorporating this into the modeling. I have yet to find any. I hope that I do, and I hope somebody might tell me that there is some effort on this. So the only models that really deal with Africa, for example, the Imperial College model from back in April, they do incorporate the lower age structure. That results in a much lower estimated death rate from COVID than in other countries. However, there is no modeling that is incorporated the impact of comorbidities, and we know that these comorbidities will increase mortality. What we don't know is the balance of this. So the fact is that we do not know if this pandemic will be more or less deadly in Africa compared to more developed economies. No one has done the work that I can find yet on that. So there's really a major effort needed to address this gap. I would recommend looking at the website Prevent Epidemics. They have launched PERC. This is the Partnership for Evidence-Based Response to COVID-19. They've launched this in Africa. and in conjunction with the African CDC, the WHO, and others, this might be a good place to house some of this effort. Okay, a second broad area in which we need better data regards human behavior. And we can talk about various aspects of this. One is mobility data, right? How are people moving around, and how does government policy influence how people move around? So there is Google mobility data is now available online. So if you go online and download that right today, you'll find about, I think it's about 4 million cases. It's an enormous data set, and it provides fairly dramatic evidence for the impact of more severe versus less severe measures in attempting to limit movement restrictions of citizens. However, this data suffers from two problems. First of all, it is biased. It's based only on smartphone users. We know that smartphone users are better off, more urban, more educated, and therefore potentially, and also more able to not move around in response to these policies and not sacrifice their livelihoods, okay? So this is not representative of the masses of people working in informal economies, earning daily incomes, needing to earn daily incomes, and who may simply not be able to limit their mobility, okay? And also this data lacks spatial specificity in most of Africa. In most of Africa, you have a single weekly estimate. So for example, on Tanzania or Zimbabwe, you have a single weekly estimate of mobility, and yet we know that this mobility is going to vary massively depending on where people live. So hopefully that data will become more spatially disaggregated over time. We need to know more about amplifying events or super spreader events, okay? So congregations of large numbers of people with some infected people. Well, we all know that food markets, especially urban food markets, but not only, are ongoing amplifying events, right? So we need data, and we can't just shut these markets down. There have been some attempts to do that, but it's very difficult to do and a big food security impact. So we need more information on those flows. And then finally, what I call micro-physical distancing. What are people actually doing in the details of their daily lives, their personal and work lives with respect to physical distancing? We know from our team in Tanzania, for example, that traders and market authorities have worked together to substantially change the layout of markets and behavior within markets, at least some urban retail markets. But we need to know much more about what's going on and what can be done. And I would say local collaboration is extreme. Into local collaboration, local knowledge, local organizational structures is very important in achieving these kinds of changes. So then thirdly, what are the impacts on spending and power livelihoods? You know, this is key, obviously, for capturing the demand side impact and the income and food security impacts of COVID-19. I've yet to see any data on this for Africa other than very broad national estimates, for example, what is produced by IFPRI. I think we can certainly speculate that, for example, reduced remittances from Europe and other Western countries may be a very important part of this impact on livelihoods. We need, however, some estimates of, you know, African emigres to Europe and other places, impacts of unemployment there, and what this impact might be on remittances. In some countries, it's going to be very important, and others perhaps not so much. Also, the role of cell phone surveys, I won't go into that. We're doing some, many people are doing some, but this can be an effective way to generate timely information in low-cost ways. So to finish up here, I'm a bit over my 10 minutes. The summary of needed actions that I see are, first of all, better modeling fed by better data along the lines of what I've talked about. I will say also then that we need to take advantage of this crisis to make the case, the long overdue case, for investment in wholesale and retail markets, okay? There's an absolute need for investment in this infrastructure, which has been woefully neglected for decades, not years. It's been woefully neglected for decades. This pandemic is showing, having bigger impact because of that neglect. We need to use this to make the case for serious investment in marketing infrastructure. Finally, and I'm probably talking too fast for my translator. I just realized that. Excuse me, please. But to finish up, what is MSU and our food security group doing? We have a food security COVID-19 webpage, which would be worthwhile for you to visit, with a lot of blog posts and views from the field about what's going on. We also worked with IFPRI to launch, to design and launch the COVID-19 policy response portal, which I would encourage everybody to go on. This is now a public good with very detailed data across 30 countries globally and their policy responses to COVID-19. Very valuable. And then finally, the Food Security Group, through our Food Security Policy Innovation Lab called PRCI, we're launching a series of collaborative research and policy outreach efforts with African and Asian partners, using cell phone surveys and then using their outreach capacities in country to influence policy with this. Excuse me for going a bit over time. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker.
Thank you, David, for that presentation. I think the emphasis on the need for producing data and modeling is important in order to inform policies, to make informed responses, as you put it. And the data on transmission, on mobility, spending patterns, and all that is certainly much needed in order to have the kinds of responses that will mitigate the spread of COVID-19 and to manage some of the effects. I think your presentation, building on the previous one, raises a number of questions which perhaps you can address later on. One is, what are the capacities from your collaborations with African institutions? You mentioned Tanzania. What are the capacities of African universities to produce this data and the models that are appropriate for local contexts? And then in terms of producing data, of course, it's important, and universities do quite a bit of that. The question that arises is how you translate the research into policy. What are the forms of engagement that are productive for the researchers, the data producers, the people producing the models, and public officials? So that relationship between research and translation into policy is one that I think is important for us to address. The third presenter is Dr. Godfrey Bahigwa from the African Union Commission.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Let me start by thanking the Africa Alliance Partnership for inviting the African Union Commission to participate in this dialogue, and also thank the Alliance for mobilizing universities, because from where we stand, universities are powerhouses of knowledge through the research that they conduct, and have the ability to share their views unhindered or without too much political consideration or being politically correct. So they are neutral sources of information that we come to rely upon. My presentation was supposed to be in three parts, starting with an overview of the current situation on the continent and the macro impacts of COVID-19. But the moderator did that at the beginning, so he saved me some time. I won't have to repeat that. The second bit was to give some key messages to this platform. And the third is to talk about what the African Union is doing in trying to address COVID-19. So I have 2 or 3 key messages to give. So the first one is, as much as COVID-19 is the topic of the day, everybody is talking about COVID-19, everybody is organizing some meeting around COVID-19. We should not forget that for Africa's food systems, this is one of the recent triple threats to our food systems in as many years. You may recall that in 2018, the continent was struggling with the fall army invasion, which spread to over 50 countries on the continent. In 2019, we had the desert locust invasion in 8 of the countries in the Horn of Africa to spread to West Africa. And then in 2020, we have COVID-19. So these are 3 threats or shocks to Africa's food systems in the last 3 years. So while we are talking about COVID-19 now, we should not forget that there are other shocks to the Africa's agriculture sector or food systems that need to be addressed because they are still with us. They haven't gone away. But for some reason, people seem to be giving too much attention to COVID-19, almost forgetting the devastating impacts that the other 2 have had. And that is in addition to climate change that impacts Africa's agriculture sector. The second observation is that it is related to the first one, that Africa's agriculture systems, while vulnerable to the impacts of COVID-19, COVID-19 cannot be blamed for the weak systems, agriculture systems or food systems on the continent. It has simply aggravated those weak systems. And therefore, when we think about the recovery measures, both in the medium to long term, they should not be just informed by the impacts of COVID-19, but by the previously underlying weaknesses within Africa's agriculture and food systems. And that's quite important. And therefore, while it is important to focus on the short-term measures to save lives, so that people must be alive, the vulnerable must be fed, it is important that it is critical that in the medium to long term, we take actions to build a more resilient food system. And as universities, this is a call to you. You should be, wherever you are operating in the respective countries, working with the governments to design policies and strategies that will then help those countries to recover better and stronger out of COVID-19. But as the moderator just mentioned, the challenge is always to see how the knowledge and research products that come from universities can actually be translated into usable information and knowledge for policy makers. And that is always an ongoing challenge for everybody. So those are my messages I wanted to pass on to this platform. Now I turn to the response by the African Union Commission. As you know, we have a continental agenda. We don't have the luxury on focusing on a few countries. And so with the concern of everybody around the impacts of COVID-19, what we, the African Union Commission, together with the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, we mobilized all our 55 member states on April 16th to a virtual meeting to discuss the impact of the pandemic on Africa's food systems and what actions needed to be taken. The meeting was attended by over 45 ministers for agriculture across the continent. Huge turnout in that platform. And basically the ministers discussed 5 topics. They discussed the short-term measures around social protection, how to ensure effective response and ensure that the recovery will be responsive. They discussed, the second topic was about crop calendars and recommendations for COVID-19, how, in other words, how to support farmers to plant for the current seasons so that they can be able to harvest and have adequate food in the next 3-4 months. We talked about measures for protecting and ensuring that domestic markets continue to operate despite COVID-19. We also talked about the need to keep trade open, emphasizing the need for intra-Africa regional trade, taking advantage of the newly created continental free trade area. And the fifth was the need for ensuring that agriculture input supply chains remain operational, and especially supporting small-scale farmers, fish farmers, as well as livestock farmers across the continent. So that ministerial meeting, which was a landmark meeting, adopted a political declaration calling on member states to take actions to address COVID-19. And to ensure that the declaration did not go to sleep, the ministers created a task force composed of different organizations: African Union Commission, the FAO itself, the European Commission, Africa Development Bank, the World Bank, International Fund for Agricultural Development, World Food Program, and the AU Development Agency. So quite a high-level task force was created, and the responsibility of that task force was basically to ensure that the political declaration was widely disseminated, both within the continent, but also globally, among other actors and especially the international development partners. And also, the other task was to ensure that the responses are not misaligned to ongoing efforts. In other words, we should not be creating new things or new approaches when we have existing ones that we have not exhausted. And in this case, calling upon alignment of interventions to Africa's Comprehensive Africa Agricultural Development Program, popularly known as CADA, but also ensuring alignment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals. The fourth action was supporting resource mobilization for member state interventions. We all know, and recent reports like the World Bank report that the moderator mentioned did indicate there is limited fiscal space at country level to address the different measures that countries are putting in place. So there is resource constraint at national level, and therefore they need to mobilize additional resources from external sources to support the implementation of the ministerial declaration. And the fourth task of that task force was to ensure that there is a coordinated and systematic support for the different new hotspots across the of food insecurity, both existing, for example, the fall armyworm, the desert locust, and now the COVID-19. That all the different players should be provide their support in a coordinated manner, so that there is no duplication of effort. So in summary, Mr. Moderator, the African Union Commission, through the Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture, is leading efforts to respond to the impact of COVID-19 on Africa's food systems. And we are doing so by mobilizing our member states across the continent, the regional economic communities, 8 of them, and our international development partners, both technical and financial, to basically put together a systematic and coordinated response to the pandemic. And also, we are looking at exploring new opportunities to respond to the short-term needs of the population, because people must remain alive. At the same time, like I said before, thinking about the medium and long-term strategies for building a resilient food system in Africa when the pandemic is over. With that, Mr. Chair, I thank you for your kind attention.
Thank you very much, Bahigwa, for that presentation, sharing with us the ways in which the AU has responded to COVID-19. Two major points that you shared with us, that you know, the messages from the AU that we should not forget other shocks and threats to the food system, and of course to development more generally. And then secondly, the AU's responses specifically in terms of alignment, coordination, resource mobilization, and so on. Some of the questions that perhaps you might elaborate on later, you know, based on what you shared with us, is how do we ensure that the that was adopted by the ministerial meeting is actually going to be implemented. We know that the government and international fora are very good at adopting declarations, but sometimes, you know, when it comes to implementation, there is a challenge. So how do we ensure the implementation? And then secondly, I think based on your you know, observations that we should not forget other shocks and threats, is how do we develop, as a result of COVID-19, a holistic approach, you know, building, of course, on a long tradition of thinking about, you know, inclusive development, integrated development, innovative development, sustainable development of states and society. How do we ensure that COVID-19 becomes part of that, as you said towards the end, immediate short-term and long-term strategies for not only dealing with the crisis, but in ensuring continuous development for the continent. The last, but of course not least, presentation is from Professor Agnes Manguela from Luanda.
Okay. Good morning and good afternoon from Luanda. Let me first of all thank the AAP for giving us this opportunity so that we can share our experience and the lessons that we've learned from this side. My presentation, may I ask Justine please to share? We'll be looking at three aspects. We'll be looking at before the COVID-19, what we have experienced, and also how we as a university, we are contributing and can continue to contribute to this emergency that we have, the pandemic for COVID-19. As the other speakers have already alluded to, even prior to COVID-19, we already had a food crisis and a food shock in most of the sub-Saharan Africa. So like in our part of the Eastern Southern Africa, we already had the desert locusts. We had the fall armyworm that had already affected food production in the area. And we also already had a drought and dry spells that affected Southern Africa, especially Zimbabwe and Zambia. So with these shocks, it was already evident that almost 45 million people in Eastern and Southern Africa were in a food crisis. And this has sustained demand for staple foods within the region and the demand for other food products that are produced. With such demand, the prices for food products have gone up. And the challenge now comes in when COVID-19 has come to the scene. So the COVID-19 is coming to exacerbate an already difficult situation with regards to food security and nutrition in the area. So the different governments in Africa have responded to COVID-19 in different ways. But as David Tschirley already observed, based on the epidemiological data, we are not yet at the peak of infections. So the peak is yet to come, but the measures have already been put in place, which are affecting both their food production and also marketing. For most of the Southern African countries, the measurements that we are coming at a point whereby farmers were harvesting their crop. It was towards the end of the season. And also it means that is also the peak time for marketing of agricultural produce. So when there was the measurements to restrict movements, measurements to restrict gatherings and operation of markets, what it means is that farmers are left with produce without people to buy. And this is leading to low prices in the producer markets, yet reducing supply in the urban centers. And the border closures and also the restricted movements are also affecting even importation of processing aids and importation of agricultural inputs for the next coming season or the winter season. And all this is going to affect the general food security situation in the country. The other thing also is that most of the countries in the region are agro-based economies relying on export of agricultural commodities and value-added produce. So with the closure, it means that there is no movement of commodities, and that reduces the forex that the countries are earning, as well as the people that are working. So the other thing that also this COVID-19 is affecting is not just the food system, but also nutrition programming within the region. As we are all aware, the nutritional status or situation in most of sub-Saharan Africa is in a bad situation. We have got very high levels of stunting, micronutrient deficiencies, and there are a number of programs that have been put in place to help alleviate these challenges. And most of these programs rely on face-to-face interaction between extension workers or health workers. And with the limitation that now, the restrictions that have been put in place in regards to people visiting clinics or people having meetings, it means the systems that were put in place to alleviate malnutrition are no longer going to be effective for the next 1 year or so, when we are still having the challenges of COVID-19. And this is therefore going to affect, for example, school feeding programs, because schools have been closed, community management of acute malnutrition, whereby children are assessed within their communities, as well as micronutrient supplementation. In addition to that, the regulatory framework that ensures that our food is properly fortified for those foods that require fortification, and even regulation of food safety becomes a challenge, because although most countries are not on lockdown, but most people are required to work from home. So that restriction in movement, it means monitoring of these essential services that ensure food security and food safety are also being compromised. At the same time, the governments have tried to put in place take-home rations and maybe social cash transfer, but the infrastructure for these social nets that are being put in place is very weak and may not be able to reach the vulnerables in both urban and peri-urban areas. Therefore, there is need for governments to ensure that there is logistics support and the protection of the food systems within the countries. Not that to want to undermine global trade, but we are in a situation whereby self-reliance and resilience within the nation has to be strengthened. So at the moment, there is need, therefore, to ensure that food production is not affected, and that the food corridors, whereby food that is produced in rural areas can be able to be transferred to the urban centers. In some countries, for example, here in Malawi, when we were preparing for a lockdown, there was provision that traders could still move from rural areas and bring produce to the main markets, produce markets in town. But the challenge now becomes that because of the reduced number of traffic, the cost of transporting food becomes very high, and then it ends up to be much higher in the urban areas. At the same time, also, we found that there is need to promote home gardens and the production within homestead, especially that in most of these in Africa, we still have that luxury that we can have space whereby households can be able to produce their own fruits and vegetables for consumption within the household. Another observation is that the COVID-19 has also provided an opportunity for strengthening local production of some of the food items that we were initially, for example, importing. Like Malawi imports quite a bit of fruits and vegetables, especially for the urban markets. But with the COVID-19, these women groups or youth can be assisted so that they can be able to access urban markets within the country and have a potential of getting lucrative prices for their production. So I would also like to maybe mention a number of activities that we as a university, we are contributing towards the response in regards to food security. The issue of research to generate data that supports policy is really important. As David Tschirley mentioned, there is data that we need with regards to our markets, how they are operating at the moment, even though it's at the time of harvest, and the general trend would have been that food prices should have been going down, but the food prices are actually going up. So we need to see what is happening apart from the transportation, but what actually is happening that is affecting the prices of food at a time whereby people have lost their jobs and people are not earning, yet food prices in the markets are going up. So that's also a data area that we need to have the data to inform proper subsidies or proper social cash transfer to be able to target those aspects so that people can still have adequate nutrition within their household. Our Department of Nutrition here within Rwanda is working with the government to study and collect data around the impact of these COVID-19 measures on the nutrition programming. So they're looking at how now can we monitor nutrition status of children? How can we monitor the nutrition status of women and make sure that fortification is being done? So this is work that is in progress, and we believe that with continued collaboration with the development partner, in this case we're working with UCAD, we should be able to produce data that will support further government policy with regards to nutrition programming within the country. At the same time, also, because of the disruption in the food corridors and movement of food, there is now need to look at the entrepreneurial side of agriculture. And as a university, we are involved in an agribusiness and value addition incubation, which we feel that as the AAP universities, we can work together and learn from other universities, from each other, on how we can build the capacity of the youth as well as women who are in the agribusiness sector, so that they add value and be able to move their produce within this context of COVID-19. I know that like Makerere University, they have an incubation center and the program, which maybe we as Rwanda can also learn from their experience on their working with farmers as well as the potential entrepreneurs in the agribusiness sector. The other aspect is the issue of modernizing and the local and resilient food production. As much as we're looking at a 1 year and a half, maybe the area in which we're going to have this COVID-19 with us, we need to build our local food system and re-examine the underutilized species that we have in our countries that we have ignored. Maybe this is the time that we have to look back at those species, and also to look at maybe less intensive, input-intensive agriculture, especially like, for example, livestock or staple production, so that we can be able to increase production in the midst that in case we don't have inputs. So I'm thinking of agro-intensification technologies that universities like MSU and Nuana have already been working on to improve legume and cereal production and increase productivity among farmers. And also we need to map the movement of food. How is food moving from production to the markets, so that if we're going to render protection to these corridors, we need to know where they are and how they are working. At the same time, we need to capacity strengthening, both of the academia and also the civil society within the country, so that we can provide support for women cooperatives and the government in order to ensure that our food system is resilient and can still be productive even in the midst of COVID-19, the fall armyworm, and also the climate change that we've been having. So I believe that with COVID-19, it presents us an opportunity to grow our local food system and strengthen it, as well as also explore other alternative ways in which food and nutrition can still be delivered and not lose the gains that we have made in reducing malnutrition in the sub-Saharan Africa. I think with those observations, I'd like to thank you all for attending and listening to my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Mangwale, for that presentation. I think it reinforced a lot of the points that were being made earlier, as well as giving us new food for thought. Noting obviously that there were prior food crises, and that COVID-19 is reinforcing those crises by disrupting the value chain, producers and markets, nutrition programs, and so on. And of course, the various mitigations that are being done. I think the key points that are being made is that as universities, the contribution has to be in the area of research, in the area of curriculum changes with regards, for example, to having agribusiness and entrepreneurship, and of course, building productive partnerships. So the kinds of issues perhaps we can discuss include how these partnerships, particularly with civil society, can be transformative, and of course how universities can also provide the kind of training to their students that will give them the skills to make meaningful changes. And of course the whole question of food self-sufficiency. What is the scale of that self-sufficiency? You talked about the corridors from rural to urban, but also the whole question of intra-regional, trade when it comes to food during this period, how it can be enhanced and, of course, strengthened in the future. The four presentations are over, and I'm sure there are a lot of questions and areas that people would like to get elaborations. Before the meeting, a number of questions had already been raised, so we'll try to address both those questions as well as the questions that are being raised during the presentations. So the first one that I'll just go around, start with the last presentation, the last presenter rather, Professor Mangwale, is, do we have evidence of concrete policy responses in the, from the EU, following the impact of COVID-19 pandemic? If so, what are its policy guidelines and how effective have they been? In the African context, is such a response feasible? If yes, how can it work? And I think the question doesn't have to be confined to the EU. As we heard from the AU, there are all sorts of measures to address COVID-19, and Africa is involved in relationships with all sorts of international agencies, intergovernmental agencies, and the EU is a major player. So you don't have to confine your answer to the EU. But what are some of these, policy responses that align with the policy responses of African countries?
Yeah, so if we are to learn from the EU with regards to food security and nutrition, we would want to look at the aspect of social cash transfers, whereby people have access to a basic minimum income that allows them to be able to access food. And also in terms of the EU allowing
I think we're having trouble with
even though during the, they still have the, in Africa, some of, am I audible now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so I was saying that, like, for example, in the EU, there is the provision whereby people had access to funds so that they could be able at least to manage to get food. And they also maintained access to shopping for food, for food markets. While in Africa, the idea of social cash transfer has been considered, but very few countries that have managed to put in a social cash transfer or food basket to provide for the food for those who are vulnerable, which means that they still have to be a way that people, even in the African context, have to still earn their own living and maybe still consume from what they have produced. Which is the usual way in which food Africans support themselves. So with regards to ensuring food security, there isn't much that we can directly import. We have to figure out what best works for us in our own context of our production and the movement of food from rural to urban areas. Thank you.
Connected to that is a question perhaps I can address to Professor Mbaye. To what extent are past valuable food practices being rediscovered and put into use in Africa because of COVID-19?
Professor Mbaye? Alors, c'est exactement...
thank you, that's exactly, well, that's the trend that we have to look into. Now, as I speak, we have abandoned many of our traditional habits. So these habits used to really sustain many of our activities. So it's based on our civilization, African civilization. These have led to imbalances. If I take the case of Senegal, my country, we have a standardization of food diets, westernization of our food system, etc. Some of our crops, some of our species that were used in the past have just backtracked. This led a little bit to that imbalance and problem of food insufficiency. Now, it's very vital to really on that, and let's inventorize those products, those historical products, and see what are those customs, the use that we have to used to have in the past, and see how we can be innovative and put all that at the heart and soul of our systems of food production. And but also we have to see how we can reintroduce these product, these species, the species that are used in rural areas. All these things put together, these former things or products have to be used. Have to take ownership of our past, really, and then we can really go beyond. And in our universities, well, we can play a pivotal role in that, because we have historians, we have anthropologists, we have scientists in all walks of all domains, and so we have to see how we can revisit all this, pack it together, work it, and really this can help us really address our food sovereignty problems. Thank you.
Thank you for that. There is a question.
Merci infiniment. J'ai une question concernant.
I need to change my own. Okay. Yeah, there is a question on the Q&A that I would like to direct to Tschirley. How is COVID-19 affecting inter-regional food commodity trade? For example, the trade between East African countries might be affected by concerns that lorry drivers are transmitting the virus between countries. Are other regions experiencing the same thing? Do we know whether this is impacting food availability?
Yeah, thank you, Paul. So I'm sure that there are others that have more specific data and knowledge on this than I do. What I do know is that, yes, there have been restrictions at borders, even when trying to allow flow. There have been delays in food being able to move. We know that not just in Africa, across the world, there's an immediate tendency by policymakers to close borders when a crisis erupts. That has not been uniform across the region so far, but some countries have tried to close things down. So, my answer can't be very specific because I don't have the data at hand. I do know that globally, overall food supply is not a problem, but logistics and barriers to trade very much are a problem, and that is therefore then causing some of these problems. So these limits on movement apply not just regionally, as the question suggests, but also internally, right? So I think it's a big part of the problem right now. I can't be more specific than that at this point. Sorry.
Thank you. I have a question by Dr. Bahigwa, and it combines two questions in a way from the Q&A. One is, you talked about, of course, the ministerial meeting, and one of the participants is asking, many times declarations happen in such big meetings. Do we ever go ahead to analyze the implementation and the effect on the community? And connected to that, from your experiences at regional or national levels, are the current policies in a position to support the various initiatives being proposed to respond to the challenge?
Yes, thank you, moderator. Yes, I had taken note because you had mentioned it in your summary after my presentation around the concern about whether the declaration would be implemented. One of the reasons for organizing that ministerial meeting was to look for practical ways of addressing COVID-19, going beyond simply ministers meeting and ending a meeting with a declaration. So the chair of that meeting, who is the Minister of South Africa, who happens to also be the AU chair for the Specialized Ministerial Committee on Agriculture, Rural Development, Water and Environment, ensured that there is a task force to oversee the implementation of this declaration. And the task force was given tasks which I mentioned in my presentation. But beyond those tasks, we also formed work streams around the 4 actions required of the task force. I will not get into the details of those task forces, but one of them I can give an example is about resource mobilization. Because at the end of the day, whatever actions member states come up with, they either have to look for additional resources domestically through their own treasuries, or they have to look for grants or loans externally. So that task of resource mobilization was given to the World Bank and the Africa Development Bank. And they have been working hard together with us and our guidance to look into existing portfolios of projects that they are already implementing either at national level or regional level, and repurposing them to respond to COVID-19. This is actually taking place. So it is not just talk, it is ensuring that whatever the actions ministers agreed to are followed up by actions, and we can mobilize resources for them. So that is one concrete thing that has come out of the ministerial declaration. Number 2, also in terms of accountability. So it was not a one-off meeting. The ministers agreed that they will be meeting every 2 months to review the progress being made in the implementation of the actions in the declaration. So every 2 months, we have to organize the ministry again. And actually the next meeting will be on July 27th to report back the progress that we are making. And number 3, knowing that the interventions to respond to COVID-19, but more broadly to ensure functional food systems, they do not fall only in the Ministry of Agriculture. There are aspects to trade. We have been talking about regional trade, and the last question you were asking, David, was about regional trade, as well as financing. So what we have agreed that the meeting of July 27th will not just bring together ministers of agriculture, we are bringing together ministers of trade, as well as ministers of finance. So it is going to be a tripartite meeting among those ministers of agriculture, trade, and finance. Because when they are together, then it will be much easier for the ministers of agriculture to make their case for additional financing from domestic resources, or to make a case for mobilizing external resources. So really, we are going all the way out to make sure that the actions in the declaration do not end up unimplemented, but action is taken to ensure that they benefit our member states across the continent. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There is a question that was asked prior to this meeting, and I've also noticed that a similar question is being asked in different ways. And I would direct it to all of you to reflect, starting with Professor Mangwela, and that is, the impact of COVID-19 when it comes to food, security, just like any development in society, is very differentiated. It affects different social groups differently, and the mitigations, of course, also they have different ways of responding to whatever mitigations and interventions the state is putting, and those can be divided into at least 4 major groups. One is the impact on gender, women and men. How is it, the issue of food security affecting them during this moment? Secondly, in terms of geography, rural and urban areas. And within the urban areas, of course, those poorer parts of the cities, informal settlements, and others, which even traditionally, sometimes they can be food deserts in all sorts of different ways. And then thirdly, in terms of generation, how is it affecting old people and children Professor Manguela, you mentioned about nutritional interventions for school children which are being disrupted. So what is the impact on different age groups? And then, of course, for people living with a disability, what is the impact? And you don't have to answer each one of these elements. You can address one or two, and then we'll just go around, starting with Professor Manguela.
Okay, thank you very much for the question. In fact, the impact is really varied, and at the moment, if we look at the aspect of the spatial distribution, that is the rural, urban, peri-urban. My take would be that at this point, it is mostly the peri-urban and urban poor in African cities that are at this point mostly may be affected because of reduced income, and because most of them rely on daily earnings for them to buy food and the like. So there is that, they will be highly negatively affected with regards to access to food. At the same time, in the same urban areas, because of reduced activity, people are working from home, children who are supposed to be at school are now at home. We are mostly also looking at another possible food and nutrition challenge that we may have with regards to issue of non-communicable diseases, because now people may not have access to fresh vegetables and fresh foods, and the chances of eating unhealthy is also very high. And so that's another aspect that maybe is not being considered in terms of the programming and the response. But that's another effect that we would have based on the spatial distribution. The rural areas, like in currently the case in Malawi, now is the harvest time. So most people would be consuming from their own harvest and maybe getting some few things from the market. But maybe 2-3 months down the line, the picture is most likely going to change when the own harvest runs out, and if we don't have we don't address the distribution aspect of food, then that will become a challenge, because now people will have to buy at very high prices. The other issue maybe of gender, generally, whenever you have women and female-headed households, they're most likely going to be very much disadvantaged, because their earning capacity to support households in the midst of a crisis is also much more compromised as compared maybe to do a dual earning or a male-headed household. So I think those would be my contribution on that.
Thank you very much. David?
Yeah, so I would largely echo Professor Manguela on where within food supply chains the impacts are going to be largest and kind of the time dimension of this. I'd recommend a blog post by Tom Reardon, which is on our own FSG and also the FP blog site, that talks about food supply chains and where the impacts are likely to be largest. So I think the distinction is, as Agnes said, is that in the shorter and medium run, the impacts will be most acutely felt in urban areas and in the post-farm segment of the supply chains, right? I mean, this is kind of immediate livelihood impacts on the very, very millions and millions of small-scale traders and food processors that are the foundation for the post-farm segment of the food system. They're already being, quite terribly affected. But of course, then over time, effects at this level get transmitted down to the farm level. So currently, both the direct impact of the pandemic, of the disease itself, and the economic impacts are likely being mostly felt at the post-farm and urban and peri-urban areas. But those effects are going to get transmitted down to rural areas. So it's very, very, very important to realize that about half of all income in rural areas of Africa is from non-farm activities, right? So non-farm income is very important in rural Africa. So as that's disrupted, impact. And then if you additionally disrupt the ability of farmers to be able to sell their food at remunerative prices, and we talk about, for example, how prices in rural areas have fallen at the same time that prices in urban areas have risen, right? So you're going to have an additional impact on farmers. So, you know, over time, everybody's going to be impacted, but it will vary also over time. Nutritional impacts, I think Agnes covered those well, and I'll leave that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. There is a question that was asked before, and I see some questions asked now that seem to align with that question. And it's which doors has COVID-19 opened in Africa with regards to opportunities that you know, food production systems, food distribution systems, access to foods, you know, and so on and so forth. So what do you see as the opportunities? And I will direct that question to Dr. Godfrey Bahigwa and Professor Mbaye to address it. What opportunities have been opened up?
Yeah, thank you, moderator. I think for where I sit at the African Union Commission, and we are a political organization, a political continental organization, the opportunity that we are seeing is for the implementation of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area. As you know, it was adopted last year, and it was supposed to come into force from July 1st, 2020. Of course, because of COVID-19, that may have to be delayed. A decision has not yet been taken if that is going to be postponed to a later date. But what we are seeing is the opportunity to, under the framework of the Continental Free Trade Area, to increase intra-regional trade in agricultural commodities and specifically on food. And what we have observed, and this in a way trying to respond to the question that was asked to David earlier, what we have observed is actually many countries across the continent did not close their borders to their neighbors. And that's why there was concern about transmission of the disease across borders by truck drivers, while the rest of the population was under lockdown. I think the call was a continental call by African leaders to keep borders open in support of the Continental Free Trade Area. So it would have been very disappointing if we had seen rampant border closures across the continent. That would have been in contravention of the spirit that the same heads of state agreed to facilitate or to put in place measures that facilitate intra-Africa regional trade. So for us, at the continental level, we are seeing that COVID-19, despite its effects and disruptions on production systems, when it has come to trade, we see most member states have kept their borders open, and we see that as an opportunity going forward to increase trade in agricultural commodities on the continent. Thank you.
Professor Mbaye, very briefly, we are running out of time. What do you think are the opportunities?
Merci, Professor Paul.
Thank you, Prof. Paul. This pandemic shows the fragility of our systems, of our methods, intervention methods. So this is becoming an opportunity, kind of window that should allow us to revisit things and see what are our strengths. This will help us build and construct auto-centered development schemes, not just an exclusion vis-a-vis other groups, but we'll have to revisit all our strengths and see how, at the national level, at the domestic level, because as you all know, the when we had this pandemic, mobility was reduced, borders were closed, and each and every country found itself really managing their own business. So this led, or this showed the emergence of all the possibilities that each and every country may have in order to address the obstacle, the constraint thing. So we have to see to what extent how we could really improve our production systems so that we could really go toward the constitution of stocks, the bumper stocks, safety, safety stocks, so that each and every time there's a disaster, imbalance of this nature, so that people could really survive and strive. And this, we have to have some kind of inclusivity. We have to see what are those forces, what are those actors, those players that can really sit together around the table and see toward which direction people should go in order to, in addressing problems encountered at the national level, problems encountered domestically. These are the few words I wanted to share with the House. Thank you.
Thank you. My last question is for everybody, and you all have just half a minute to address it. If you were to advise your vice chancellors, your university councils, you know, and then at the same time you're advising your ministers of finance and agriculture, what would you advise as to the relationship that should be developed between universities and governments now in dealing with COVID-19? Let's start with Professor Mangwela very quickly.
I think COVID-19, because keeps on changing very rapidly, this gives us an opportunity for government and university to work together on solutions with generating data and knowledge that can easily be transformed into actionable programs. So it gives us that opportunity of working under pressure and producing results within a short period of time. So let's utilize this chance.
Thank you. David, Tschirley?
So I assume that that question would not be directed to me since I'm not sitting in Africa and advising. So first of all, you know, I would congratulate the ministers. I wouldn't do it personally, but I think they deserve congratulations for what Godfrey said, that borders were largely not closed. That's a really, really, really important first step. They would need, however, to put in, I would say, and then in keeping with my presentation, better systems for tracking the movement of people and tracking the flow of goods as part of a broad effort to generate data and modeling and predictions on the spread of the disease. Thank you. I know that's only a partial response, but I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Professor Mbaye, very quickly, half a minute.
Merci.
Thank you, Prof. This is truly, you know, what I had to say was really what I support. We have to meet together. We have to build, construct task force and reconstruct the system so that each and everyone has a role to play. These scholars, the universities, research institutions, and policymakers all have to sit together. And we have to, so that we can really generate interventions, tangible action that can really help our grassroots populations better take advantage of resources that are made available locally. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Unfortunately, we have to stop now. We have come to the end of this session. I think you will agree with me that the four panelists shared very important insights into the impact of COVID-19 on economies and specifically on food systems and food security that we all need to pay attention to. And I invite you to come to the next session, which will be coping with mental health, impacts of COVID-19 in higher education, responses and lessons learned. With that, I will now give back to the organizers of the session to have the last word. Thank you very much.
Hello.
Sorry, Jamie or Josie, Amy or Josie?
Isaac.
Hello, hello. Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Isaac Minde. I'm Associate Director in the Alliance for African Partnership, and I'm the coordinator for this particular dialogue. My role is simple, but a very important one, and that is to thank everyone, starting with the moderator, the panelists, the audience, and also my AAP team for their excellent performance in their respective areas. Thank you very much. I believe there were take-home messages and also some homework for every one of us. So I would like to again say thank you. And right now I would like to basically inform you about the next dialogue. And that is going to be 2 weeks from today. And so the title is going to be Coping with Mental Health, Impacts of COVID-19 in Higher Education, Responses and Lessons Learned. And we have 4 panelists, just to mention their names: Ruthie Rono, who is the Deputy Vice Chancellor, Academic and Student Affairs, United States International University in Nairobi, Kenya. Then you have Lamine Diaye, Professor of Anthropology, UCAD in Senegal. And then we have Jonathan Novello, Health for You consultant and licensed clinical social worker, Michigan State University, United States. And last but not least, Luki Odirile, Director, Career and Counseling Center, University of Botswana. So you are very much welcome. Please mark this on your calendars. Thank you again, thank you again, thank you.